Thanks, Steve. And thanks, Chad, for that summary of the history of the Lanterman Act. My name is Pat Hornbecker, and this is
Tim, both parents of a son with developmental disabilities.
Joseph has Angelman syndrome. He's 41 years old. So I've been working with these services for a very long time. And it's important for families to understand this, and that's why we're doing it. Today, we're here to talk about the entitlement called the Lanterman Act and the IPP process, how to write it, how to get it, how to fight it, how to make it successful. So let's start with the entitlement. The entitlement is unique to California in that it is a right for people with developmental disabilities to be provided the services and supports that they need. It is also an obligation of the state to provide these services. This is a promise. This is a contract with the people with disabilities in the state of California and their families to make sure that they get the services they need. Now, to do this, you actually have to know some of the players in this team. There are the people with disabilities and their families. There are regional centers across the state, and there is the Department of Developmental Services in Sacramento. There are also lots of providers across the state that help provide these services, and we'll show you how they factor in to this process as we go through. But remember, California is the only state that has this entitlement, this promise to people with disabilities. The IPP, which is the individual program plan, is very important because it's a document. It is a legal document that guarantees the services you should be receiving. It is through this IPP process that the rights of this act are granted to the individuals with developmental disabilities. And then California and the Department of Developmental Services is obliged to implement this plan. So the process itself defines the services. And we do this through meetings. And usually at the regional center, now we do everything by Zoom. So a regional center is in your area. There are 21 regional centers across the state. And I work with Golden Gate Regional Center in the San Francisco Bay Area. Regional centers assess needs, and they lead the IPP process, and they deliver services, sometimes in-house and sometimes through vendors, also through a number of other ways, which we'll get into when we get into the nitty-gritty of actually how to write an IPP. Parents and consumers can be involved in the local regional centers because they are a nonprofit with boards, and they often have parents and consumers who are involved in their boards. The trick of the IPP and writing the IPP is making sure you get all of the services you need into that document that we're talking about. To write an IPP, you need a planning team. The planning team is made up of the individual with disabilities and the family members or legal guardian, a conservator, if there is one legally assigned, an authorized representative, which we'll talk about later, as well as your service coordinator at your local regional center. He or she is a service coordinator, a social worker who is assigned to your case. They have a lot of cases that they're dealing with, so get to know your social worker. Find out if she knows anything about the disability that your son or daughter may have. Joseph has Angelman syndrome. It's not as prevalent as some other disabilities, but don't assume that they understand what you're talking about your son's disability. It's important to get to know them, see if they're culturally competent in your language or your culture, and understand what your needs might be as a family member or as an individual with disabilities. Again, I can't stress strongly enough that if you do not get a service written into the IPP, it will not happen. So when you have the IPP meeting, make sure that these conversations that go on for possibly a couple of hours at the end result of the discussion is to get the service written in to the IPP. Now, we're talking about services. There's 255 coded services, give or take, in the Welfare and Institutions Code for people with disabilities. And we have a handout here that gives you a summary of the kinds of services. But I'd like you to understand that this is just a suggestion of the kinds of services you may need. You need to understand that you are choosing a service because it's directed toward the alleviation of a developmental disability, or it is directed toward the social, personal, economic, or physical remediation or rehabilitation of a particular service, of a particular disability, or towards the maintenance and achieving of independence and a productive, normal life. So this is why you are going to select a particular service to be delivered through your IPP. And one of the things that we also have learned over the years is that each regional center is different. They are independent nonprofits. So if you go from San Francisco to Fresno, let's say, you are going to possibly experience a difference in the policies on the delivery of some of these systems. It is these POS, which is a purchase of service policy, can vary, but have to be okayed by the Department of Developmental Services. It's a compliance check from DDS to check on how regional centers are actually delivering services. You can experience the difference, but if you are experiencing refusals of services that are authorized by the Department of Developmental Services, you need to understand why. And so if you don't understand why this service is being refused or is being modified in a way that's unsatisfactory, request the authority upon which they are making this decision. They have to have received a letter from the Department of Developmental Services that most likely refers to Title II or Title 17. Just ask them, what's the authority? It'll be a letter that they have on file at the regional center that'll tell you why they are able to refuse a service or do it differently than they were doing it in San Francisco.
This next section of the Welfare and Institutions Code is all about choice. Persons with developmental disabilities shall have the right to choose everything that they need for their own life. That could be, for example, with whom they live, where they live, their employment, their leisure time, job training, as well as just an internship. So those have to be taken into consideration. They can be summed up again in personal choices, person-centered planning, which you've heard so much about, and just nothing about me without me. The rights of individuals with developmental disabilities shall include choices made by consumers. So it's all about the consumer, or the participants are the term we use, and making their choice. No pre-written IPPs. This happens occasionally where you will receive an IPP that's pre-written. You just can say, no, I will not accept that. IPPs have to be a combination of your decisions, your choices, as well as approved by the regional center. But you just can't get a pre-written IPP. So they must respect, most importantly, the values of the person with developmental disabilities. Public and private agencies like the regional center or the providers shall provide consumers with relevant information to help you understand your choices. What do you want? I don't know. What's available? And so often when these questions are asked, you think of maybe one or two services. And as we said, there are 255 services. Those services actually are explained in 80 pages of PDFs. So you don't have to read all those, but you want to definitely be familiar with those services so that you can see which services will be good for you, or you as an individual, or for your parents and guardians and legal representatives. So it's very important that your case manager or your services coordinator has somebody there that can explain these services to you if English is not your first language. So, for example, Mandarin, Tagalog, Spanish, English, those languages have to be in explaining these services to you. In the regional center's website, they actually have these services in your various languages. So really be concerned about those languages. One thing that I want to also take into consideration is the person with a developmental disability, whether they need a communication device, whether they need the information in Braille. First and foremost, it's the choice of that individual with developmental disabilities. And I just wanted to also add the need for cultural competency. And I say that because in some situations, and especially in some cultures, finding a job isn't the most important thing. You have families that take care of their grandmother, they take care of their aunt and uncle. It's really an extended family, and they're very, very close-knit. So they may want more respite than maybe a job placement in the community. So you have to be aware of the cultural diversity of those particular people. I use an example that when I was working in the Coachella Valley, I had a consumer, and the family that she was with was very reluctant to have her work in the community. Well, I was getting funding for the regional center to have her work in the community, but I didn't have funding for any other service or any other supports. So if I was going to get her a job, which I did at the hotel, the local hotel, and she was very, very good. Even though she was deaf, she was very good at working the machine called a mangle. Now, if nothing else that you get out of this presentation is you'll learn what a mangle is. But she could iron more sheets in that large mangle that you just stick sheets through when you're working at a hotel, and they come out the other end. But guess what? In order to get her that job, I had to get her Aunt Tia a job too. That's how her parents felt comfortable with her going out in the community. Now, we didn't get paid for that, but those are some of the differences that you have to take into consideration when you're working with people from different cultures. You have the right to a designated representative. Now, who is that? It can be a parent, a family member, or a friend. But notices need to be sent to those designated relatives, designated representatives, who could be a relative, as well as other family members, guardian, or conservators. Notices need to be sent to those representatives. Why would you want a representative? That's a big question that comes out. Well, another person can hear or witness as well as just you. So when the regional center is saying, well, we never offered that choice, and you have that witness, that representative that's with you, you have it right then and there. You say, oh, no, we both heard that. So it's very good to have a witness. And sometimes that witness may be somebody, if you need a translator. So take those into consideration when you're looking for people to be your representative. A sample letter is attached. And in that sample letter, I sort of emphasize that it's not just the meeting that has to be, you have to be notified of. It's these notices have to go out if there is other locations, phone calls, verbal meetings. So it's not just a meeting in person. The regional center must be given a written notification of any permanent changes and an assigned service coordinator. And this is very important. They have to give you that notice in 10 days. I've had situations where it's been 3 days, maybe 5 days, and all of a sudden you find out that you have another service coordinator. That's not enough time for you. That 10 days before your next meeting, you need to have somebody be telling you that you have a new service coordinator. And then at that meeting, you can either choose to accept that person or not to accept that person.
And the service coordinators are someone you need to get to know, as I said, which is why you get assigned 10 days before you're supposed to be notified. I have had many social workers assigned to us, but I think I've had some for 10 years. And then I've had 3 this year. So Having 3 different social workers makes it difficult for someone to get in touch with your history and the services you received and what changes might be necessary in the next phase of your life. So this is why we come to writing these individual program plans. What are the needs and preferences? And the law stipulates that you must respect and adhere to the needs and preferences of the individual with developmental disabilities. It's all about person-centered planning. The plan is written around the individual with disabilities. And it does involve the family at times when there's family burnout. Oftentimes respite is a reason services are given to families because the individual with disabilities is has very intense needs, and there are other siblings in the family, and so having respite is very important. In-home respite, out-of-home respite, but it's important to take account the needs and preferences of the individual. The purposes of some of the goals and objectives that are being written are written for to promote community integration and independence, to gain a productive and normal life with stable health and healthy environments. It's really, really important that is why we are choosing these. We're not choosing these services just willy-nilly. So this is an important understanding necessary for the person-centered plan to be written. The writing of the IPP is very interesting. You need to write a number of goals and objectives. That's the first thing. What is a sample of some goals? And if you've been in the school system, you probably have written goals in your IEP, Individual Education Plan. And if you have those goals, we're looking at similar goals probably at a more adult life, or even during the years while you're in school. You're looking at needs that the family and you need to support you in your independence. Some of these goals might be eating independently. It could be sleeping through the night, walking home from program, taking the bus to and from program, exercising regularly, shopping for meals. Those are examples of the kinds of goals you might have in an IPP. Then you're going to figure out who is going to provide these services. Well, these services can be provided by contract providers. If you were needing a behavioral plan written, you can have a contract provider. You can have a vendor like the ARC. We use the ARC of San Francisco, provides a lot of the vendorized services for my son Joseph. There's generic services that are used. A generic service would be something that's usually available to the general public, something like Muni, getting a Clipper card, or having a membership to the local YMCA. Those are the kinds of things that we would often use for a generic service. There's also natural supports. Now, what are natural supports and why would you write them into the IPP? A natural support would be, well, when Joseph gets home from program, grandma's at my house. They're covering the gap of time between the end of the program day and when I get home from work, which could be 3 or 4 hours. That's a natural support. It's not paid for by the regional center, but it's something that needs to be put into the IPP. Sometimes, as one of the goals was to shop for meals. Well, on the way home from program, Joseph stops at the local grocery store and he gives his list of shopping items to the grocer. This grocer has been on this corner for 20 years, and it's someone who knows Joseph, watched him grow up. He's going to take that list, help him fill the list out, pay for it, and send him on his way. Now, that's a natural support. It's not something that's paid for by the regional center. Why would they care? That has to be written into your IPP. It's a way of achieving your goals. It's a way of supporting. It's an important idea so that if it goes away, if the grocer goes away, if grandma passes away, these are supports that need to be replaced. And having that in your IPP may seem like a small detail, but it's actually very important to the overall success of the IPP. There also would be the IEP I've mentioned before is important because while you're going through your school years, you have an individual education plan. Well, if you're a client of the regional center from age 3 or so on, you also have an IPP. And oftentimes we have found out that a lot of families don't realize that they have an IPP and an IEP. So in that situation, I would make sure that you take your IEP and attach it to your IPP. And if you are the person sitting in the boat where you have an IEP, you should have an IPP and you don't know what it is, you've probably been receiving one of those pre-written IPPs. So beware and find out how you can get a hold of the IPP and figure out how you could have a meeting. Call a meeting. They have to hold one in 30 days. And then you can combine both of these documents and make sure that they understand that you understand what your rights are. In the IPP, there has to be a start date and a timeline of when these goals and objectives are going to be achieved, when they're going to start, when they're going to end. Most IPPs are reviewed every year. You can review them more recently. The law says that you have to do it within 30 days. So if the regulations, if you call your social worker and say, I need to have an IPP because this has happened in our lives and we need to adjust some of these goals. Joseph's been sick, or I've been sick, or something has come up, so we need a new IPP. Then they have to hold it within 30 days. The start date would be the start date of when the services are going to start. Let's say we write the IPP today and we're going to say that everything starts tomorrow. Or we're going to say that 6 of the 10 goals can start today, but the service for music therapy can't start right now because we don't know who's going to provide it. We don't have a vendor. We don't have a contract provider. Who's going to do that? Well, then you write into the IPP that we're going to give 30 days for the regional center to find that vendor and find that individual, find whoever is going to provide that service, and then provide the service. If that doesn't happen within that timeline, that's going to trigger us to hold another meeting. So those are the timelines that are really important. And again, if you need an IPP at any time because something has changed, then you can call it and it will prompt the meeting within 30 days. This is a jointly planned meeting. We're working together as a team. It's the individual with disabilities, their parent, family member, their legal guardian, their conservator, and the social worker representing the regional center. We all have to be in agreement. To do that, all of that needs to be decided at the meeting. It's important to know that the people at this meeting can make this decision. The decisions are made here by the social worker and you as a team. There is no veto power and there is no committee down the hall that's going to be deciding the services. You need to make sure that you have the conversation, you write it into the IPP, and that is the end of that discussion. But make sure after the discussion, it did get written into the IPP. The final agreement that we come to may not be everything you wanted. So if there's one service that's debated, we agreed on everything except music therapy for just the one I'm picking out, then you need to be able to the regional center must hold a meeting within 15 days of this meeting. So before you go to your IPP, pull out your calendar and look for a date, 2 weeks, 15 days hence, that you are willing to come to a meeting. You can make it longer. They can't make it longer. You can hold the meeting in a month if you choose to. However, if the regional center is going to meet your needs for this debated service, then you need to make sure that that meeting is held within 15 days. So that is their obligation. Then if you don't agree with some of these services, then there is a possibility of triggering the fair hearing process. You need to understand that fair hearing is your recourse to the disagreement on the service that's being debated. So you have the next meeting in 15 days and you still don't agree, but you think that this service is something that's necessary for your child to be successful and promote his or her independence. This fair hearing sounds threatening. It sounds legal. It sounds upsetting to a lot of family members, but it is a process that can be handled with an informal meeting. It can be handled with mediation, where an independent person is assigned to the particular case to listen to both sides of the discussion about receiving the music therapy or respite or transportation. And then they will decide what's going to move forward. And then there is, of course, the going to court, which is a possibility, but very few cases actually go there. You can go to your own to the website of the Department of Developmental Services, which is dds.ca.gov, and they will provide you with data on the fair hearing. Just click on fair hearing. It'll give you the right forms you need. It'll tell you what your rights are in the process and give you the timeline. I'm going to review some of that right now. But understand that the fair hearing process is specifically about a disagreement about services. And that's important to understand. So that if you decide that you are arguing about the service, you're calling for another meeting, or you're just filing for a fair hearing. If you have all the services that written into your IPP, and in the course of the next few months, you realize, well, by the way, transportation has stopped. I don't get a bus anymore for my son to go to program. What's happened? And the regional center has stopped delivering the transportation service. Well, that doesn't make sense. You should have received a notice, and there's a proposed notice of proposed plan, a proposed action, which is oftentimes it's 1803, I think, is the number of the form, and we have it here on our slides to reference that the regional center should be notifying you if you've changed your transportation. Let's say they're changing from transportation to program to no transportation at all. You don't have to accept that. You've agreed to it at the meeting. They're unilaterally changing a service. So what you're going to do is take the form, you're going to sign it at the bottom and return it objecting, saying, I object to this proposed plan of action, and you're returning it within 10 days. You have to look at the bottom of this form, and it is very small print, but it says you have to return this within 10 days, at which point then the transportation that you've had thus far must stay. It is what I call the stay put provision. It's the way you get to keep your services while the debated service is disputed. So it's important that you send this form. Now, if you're using snail mail, you want to make sure that you're sending it in certified first-class mail with a return receipt. If you're emailing it, you're copying everyone that's on your team, your client's rights advocate, your social worker, and you're sending it to the director of the regional center. You can find that name, rank, and serial number usually on the notice of planned action, but you're also going to find it on the website of your regional center. This letter you need to save the letter. You also need to save the envelope that you got the letter in if you received the notice of proposed action, because that will have the postmark date on it. The notice of proposed action may have an entirely different date and written 2 weeks beforehand. Remember, they need to have given you notice about this plan of action, and you're responding to when you received the notice, not when the notice was actually written. So that's tricky, but it's a very non-threatening way of you to respond to a form you got in the mail very simply. So we want to make sure that the debated service keeps on trucking while we're debating it. And it will, if as long as you respond to the notice or send in your fair hearing request. Those are the most important things you need to do.
You've been explained about IPPs, about fair hearings, the right to have a designated representative. Well, there's another right that you have, and you have a right to electronically record your IPP meetings. You have the right as a consumer or a parent, legal guardian, or conservator. No permission is required. You do have to notify the regional center 24 hours in advance of the meeting, but when you notify them, it's good forever. So any subsequent meeting, you don't have to give that notice, that 24-hour notice. They're automatically going to receive that. Now, why record? Well, the same reason that you would have a designated representative. 2 videos are better than 1. And once you decide that you would like that recording, you can have the regional center automatically has the right to likewise record. So 2 recordings probably are better than 1. So when you go back, you not only have that representative, but you have 2 recordings to verify the services that we're told that you would receive. So the permission is all in your hands. You have the veto power in the hands of the consumer. However, like I mentioned, the RCD, the regional center, can also record if you've approved that. They don't need permission, but not a bad idea for you to have both recordings so that you have that information to back up what either you've asked for or what they've decided to give to you. There is a form that when you want to have a recording, and you need to put that in this notice that the letter is written, the notification in advance. And again, it's about conversations, telephone calls, or authorizations of services. It's not just the meeting that you have. It's also those phone calls or those verbal agreements that you've made over the phone. So those can all be recorded.
Make sure you copy your client's rights advocate at the regional center when you are requesting the electronic version of a meeting.
Now, the DDS IPP manual says that the regional center must have a decision maker at your IPP meeting. So it's not just in the Welfare and Institution Code, but it's in the DDS IPP manual too. Who knew? The quote from the DS manual is so important. It says real-time decisions. How do you know if a real-time decision maker is there, a person who's authorized to make that decision at that meeting? Well, is somebody here who can authorize my services? A simple question. And if no is the answer, and especially, and I've had this happen, well, I have to go to my supervisor. I'll get back to you. Stop the meeting right there and say, no, I won't have another meeting unless there is an authorized designated person. That's a real-time decision made at the meetings. A very controversial and discussed section of the Welfare and Institution Code is about the cost of services. It says that the cost of services of supports of comparable quality shall be reviewed, and the least costly shall be selected. Now, what least costly? You would think, okay, right away, I don't have a choice in that. You do have a choice in that, especially when they added the term comparable quality. I'd like to sort of summarize this, but please read this section carefully in entirety. Basically, comparable is the key word. How is comparable determined? Ask for an analysis. Ask who's authorizing this. Ask for a quality review. There could be more than one provider, and they're going to say you need to go to provider 2 instead of provider 1 because they're more expensive. Well, the key here is that you have to make sure that it's least costly if it will result in moving the consumer from the existing provider to that provider number 2, but not if it's a more restrictive or less integrated services or supports. That's the key. So they can't automatically move just to a less costly program. It has to make sure that it's not any more restrictive or less integrated as the services you're already getting.
The least restrictive environment. You've had this deal with that through the education system, and we do the same here through the IPP process. When you're selecting a service, it must be what's appropriate for the individual and not just because it's cheaper. So that is a discussion that usually happens at the IPP when you're debating who the service providers are going to be. When you are calling for meetings and they never hold a meeting, you made your request and 30 days later, there's no meeting scheduled. 60 days later, there's no meeting scheduled. That's a violation of your rights and the rights of your son or daughter. It's also the initiating process for complaints. A complaint versus the fair hearing process is important to understand. A complaint is not you just whining about something. A complaint is a violation of rights. They didn't hold your meeting when you requested it. They did not recognize my designated representative. They did not allow me to record my meeting. They did not meet the timelines that they were supposed to meet. You're not debating a service. You're not debating where the service is being given. You are debating the rights of the individual. Those rights have been violated. And that is also found, it's triggered by just sending a form. Again, you can go to the website of the Department of Developmental Services, dds.ca.gov, and type in complaint in the search role, and you will find that this form comes out. And download the form and send it in. And all you have to do is put name, rank, and serial number in the form and what your complaint is. They didn't host the meeting. They didn't recognize my desire to record the meeting. And that's a violation of your rights. That will trigger some timelines. You're sending this to the director of the regional center, and you're going to copy the client's right advocate and your social worker and whoever else is on your team, parents, family, a designated representative. This form simply will state what the violation is, and then you send that on to the regional center. And what you'll find is that the director of regional center now has 20 working days. Those 20 working days to investigate the violation of the right and determine a resolution to solve it. Well, host the meeting, recognize the person, whatever the rights are being violated. Hopefully that director of the regional center is going to be able to provide the resolution. That resolution will be sent to you by mail in order to, with a name, rank, and serial number of who you're supposed to respond to. If you do not respond, that resolution will go into effect. If you do respond and don't like it, you think this is not the right resolution to your debate, then that takes it up to the next level. And it goes up to the Director of Developmental Services. You go up there, and now that person has 45 days to come to a resolution of the debated right that's been violated. This correspondence, again, I have to tell you to keep records of it. If you're doing anything by mail, make sure you make copies of what you've received and what you're sending off, and save all the postmarks on the envelopes. These timelines are important, and it's important that you be able to understand when and where certain things are supposed to be happening. If the solution is not satisfactory, then you are moving it up to the next level. If you don't answer it within the 20 days at all, then the resolution will go forward as already proposed. And why would you file these complaints or fair hearings? A lot of people find it very intimidating, but it's valuable to the entire system. As advocates, we want to know what's wrong with the system so that we can continue to maintain the entitlement as it exists and strengthen it, find the holes that are in our system. And we will find that by understanding what services are continuing to be denied to people with disabilities across the state. Is it only in rural areas or urban areas that we're finding an increased difference in the delivery of services? Are we finding that certain rights are being violated through the complaint process? And if you go to the website, you can actually go and click on all the fair hearings that have been held, and you'll see how many have been held with regard to certain kinds of services, the delivery of respite or the lack of delivery of respite, because that's usually what the debate's been about. You'll find that there's a lot of debate in the compliance issues, usually on the timelines of hosting meetings. Many of them you'll also find how easily they're resolved. They're easily resolved with that letter. And that's why it's important that you continue to fight to keep the entitlement as strong as it is. And it only will stay this strong if, in fact, we continue to fight for our rights. So don't be afraid of the complaint process or the fair hearing process. It is usually something you're going to seek support. And there are people, advocates out there, there are attorneys, there are lots of providers of services that are willing to advocate with you to make sure that your rights are upheld under the Lanterman Act.
The Lanterman Act and its promise will only survive if family members like you, friends and consumers, are vigilant and service and active. And I say this because, as you've been previously explained, it's all about parents getting together. For example, that's where the Lanterman Act came from. It was legislator Frank Lanterman who was sort of confronted in an elevator. And finally, after writing the Lanterman Act, he finally got it approved by President Reagan, and we have those services to this day. But we must hold those same legislators and our current legislators accountable. We need to pressure, protect, and expand services. And by that I mean, if there's more respite needed, and there's only so much allowed at this given time, there was none. It was like 20 hours a month. You need to ask for more of those. We maybe need to change lots of legislation so more is approved by the regional centers. We need to organize your people with disabilities, family members, and friends to have a voice and to tell your stories. You need to be able to tell the impact of what those services mean to you by what's your son or daughter, or you in particular, are receiving, or what you're not receiving. Those stories need to be told if we're going to continue the Lanterman Act. More voices equal more power and influence. So I just have, I wanted to share with you that, I went to a legislator. I asked that legislator with a family member, a mom, and with her daughter with disabilities. And I asked that legislator, please don't cut $200 million from the state budget for people with developmental disabilities. We asked him, we spoke to him. He said, oh, sure, we won't let that happen. How do you think that worked out? They only cut $175 million. What would have happened, I had to ask myself, if instead of that one parent and that one daughter with developmental disabilities, I had 200 other parents and people with disabilities in the hallway? Would have definitely had a greater impact. So you need to tell your stories, but you need to get other people to tell their stories too if we want to have influence and power. Work with other disability groups as well, senior groups, other disability groups, transportation groups, people trying to get transportation that have disabilities. Work with them all so that we have a bigger clout, more power. There are 800,000 people with developmental disabilities in the United States that are still on waiting lists for services. 200 in the state of Texas alone, 200,000. So we are the only state with this entitlement to services because of the Lanterman Act. Help us keep it.
I want to thank you so much. And I always learn something new every time I listen to this. Now, I just have a few questions. The first off is you talked a little bit about the right to attend here, the IPP and the designated representative. Can you go into a little bit more about, maybe specifically for parents, when is it appropriate for a parent to attend, and when is it inappropriate for a parent to attend?
Well, I think it's appropriate for a person to attend, a parent, or actually any designated representative, if the person is not conserved. That person with developmental disabilities has the choice whether a parent is there or not. They have a decision. But if they are conserved, if they have the family member designated representative who could be a conservator as well, if that's the case, that person with developmental disabilities has the decision on who comes to their meeting. If the person is conserved, then the designated representative could be the parent. They have the right to attend.
But the person with disabilities can say, I don't want mom there if they're not conserved, correct?
Right.
Okay.
So
That's
it's really all about consumer choice,
Right.
right? And that's what we're doing is we're talking about focusing on the choice of the individual.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Terrific. You also talked in here a little bit about the client's rights advocate. Who is this client's rights advocate, and where would you find this character?
Well, every regional center is supposed to have a client's rights advocate on staff. And that is someone who would be supporting you as a consumer and as a family member to negotiate the fair hearing process and the complaint process, or any questions you might have outside of the IPP meeting that might involve some of those parties in particular. But I don't know if they're all occupied by someone. However, I would go to my director of the regional center, I'd go to the website and I would research it. But there should be a paid position at each regional center for a client's rights advocate.
Terrific. Here's my last question. And we're recording this here the summer of 2022, here hopefully at the end of the pandemic, but we'll yet to see. But some vendors are having a real difficult time here providing staff for services, and the turnover is at an all-time high. What does an advocate do if, for instance, the services aren't being provided because of staffing issues?
Well, regardless of staffing issues, the need and the IPP has been written and validated and signed off, so the service has to be provided. So I will advocate for the fair hearing process and for the complaint process. It needs to be documented. Data talks. The data makes a difference at the state level. It makes a difference across each of the regional centers. We'll find the disparity of the staffing, and it's the only thing that's going to possibly push the legislature to actually understand that higher rates need to be authorized, that better salaries need to be authorized in order to attract the staff that is necessary to take care of our services.
And having been an executive director of over 3 programs, I can tell you for sure that it's extremely difficult in this day and age in 2022 to find staffing. The range of salaries has gone everywhere from $15 to now you can't hire anybody even at $18 an hour. So we really need, as Pat said, to get more funding for the salaries of these people if we want to find more people that can offer the services to our sons or daughters, people with disabilities.
And please remember that families and people with disabilities is what made the Lanterman Act happen. The ARC made this happen. Tim and I have worked with the ARC of California for over 35, 40 years, and it's an organization whose mission is to ensure that this Lanterman Act, that the promise of the Lanterman Act survives and is strengthened. And there's 21 chapters of the ARC across the state. It's important that they be involved in your concerns. So reach out to your chapters of the ARC. Reach out to your family resource centers. Reach out to the different groups that are supporting our mission to make sure that people understand their rights, understand the process, understand how to make it work for them, and maintain this entitlement. We want the Lanterman promise to be a promise forever. Thank you.
Thank you.